Thank you, Connie. I'm pleased to be here. The Ulster Scot is a good topic. What I have found here in North Carolina, people who are descended from the Highland Scots generally know it. They know their Highland Scot background. Many of the Ulster Scot or Scots-Irish people, really, they just say, I'm an American. They don't have much knowledge of their trip from Northern Ireland, from Scotland to Northern Ireland to America. So I found that this topic is something that people just don't know a lot about. So I'm pleased to put this together for the audience. Let's start with Mary, Queen of Scots. She was Queen of Scotland from 1542 to 1567. She was cousin to Queen Elizabeth. So she was actually in the line for the throne of England as well as Scotland. She abdicated the Scottish throne in 1567. She went to England. She was basically a house prisoner, was later in the Tower of London. She was beheaded by order of Elizabeth. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the mother of James VI of Scotland, who later becomes James I of England. Oops, wrong way. Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth of England was daughter of Henry VIII. She was Queen of England and Ireland. She was queen from 1558 to 1603, so a good period of time. She was known as the Virgin Queen. She succeeded she was succeeded in England by James VI of Scotland, James I of England. During Elizabeth's reign, the Scottish borders between Scotland and England were totally untamed. It's a wild place, raiding, robbing, and she really did nothing about that problem. Our next figure here is King James VI of Scotland, and he became King James I of England. He was King of Scots at the age of 13 months when his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, abdicated. In 1603, when Elizabeth passed, he became King of Scotland, England, and Ireland. He inhabited many problems. There was a huge Irish Catholic problem. Catholic people were, in some ways, like the Scottish Highlanders. They were wild and more remote and more difficult to, quote, tame. He had 300 years of border wars going on between the Scots and the English on the Scottish border. 300 years of this. There was coming serious religious strife. But one thing King James did do, which we'll talk about later, he did address the border war problem. He took action. Take a quick look at Great Britain here. England is down to the lower right, Wales. You've got Scotland to the north, Ireland over to the west. And right in the top of Ireland, you've got Northern Ireland, or Ulster. And if you look at Scotland, the blue part there, the Hebrides, that was the source of most of the Scottish Highlanders, of those 25,000 who settled into North Carolina in the 1700s. The border, or the red at the bottom, is the area we're talking about today. These are the border Scots and the border English. You look on the Scottish border, the dark line highlighted with yellow marker, that's the Scottish English border. If you notice down the lower right is Hadrian's Wall, the wall built by the Romans a couple hundred years in roughly the year 1100, pardon me, or 200, was actually within England. So the Scottish border follows up the Tweed River from the Solway Firth up the Tweed River to the North Sea. It's a soft border. It's about 96 miles. And this is the area where all the troubles are that we'll be talking about today. Let's look, who are the border Scots? Well, they're really a mixture of a lot of things. They're a mixture of the ancient Britons from England, of the Picts who were in Scotland, the painted people. Rome occupied England and part of Scotland for several hundred years. A lot of the Roman soldiers were actually conquered Germans. So there was German and Roman input into the blood pool on the borders. You had the Normans who came from France. The Normans were originally largely Danish Vikings who had gone to France and married with the French and really created a very sophisticated modern society. You have the Angles from Denmark, Saxons from Germany, Flemings from Belgium, the Netherlands, and Vikings from Norway. So really the bloodlines of the border Scots is really quite mixed with different European elements. Let's look at the border. The border was divided into marches. And for every Scottish march, you'd have an English march. Scottish West, Scottish Middle, English Middle, Scottish East, and the English East marches.
What does the word march mean, Don?
Well, it's equivalent to county. It's not a marsh like a swamp. It's more like an area that's more like a county. Each of the marches had a warden. So the King of Scotland or Queen of Scotland would appoint the Scottish marsh wardens. King of England or Queen would appoint the English marsh wardens. Some of these wardens were good. Many of them were very weak. They had all kind of deals. It's almost like some of the politicians we have today with all kind of financial and questionable things going on. Some of the wardens would favor certain of the Scottish clans. Some of them had allegiances on the other side of the border. One problem is the clans spilled across the border. You'd have Armstrongs, for example, on both sides of the border. And so the English Armstrongs may have favored the Scottish Armstrongs more than they favored anybody else in England. So it was a very difficult thing to govern. And the marsh wardens had inadequate military support, and the clans were always up to some no good. So it was a very difficult thing to govern. And this went on for 300 years. Look at some of the towns along the border. And these are the Reaver border towns. And I'll go into the Reavers here in the next slide. But Reaver really meant robber, was a word for the robber, robbers. The towns all along the border were subject to raids by the Reavers, and the Reavers could be English or Scottish. But some of the towns, Hawick, Jedburgh, Kelso, Berwick on Tweed, Galshiels, Melrose, Carlisle was within England, but close to the border. A lot of the activity took place in and around Carlisle. But the border raiders went all the way to Edinburgh at times. So this was a big area that was under control of the Reavers much of the time. Reivers really means robbers or raiders. They were clans that were specialized in this. They were so-called riding or robbing clans. They liked to do their raids at night. They liked to do them in the autumn after the harvests were in from the crops. And that's when their stealing was most profitable, when people had harvest stored. Cattle was the main object of the raids of the reivers, but they would take pigs, horses, or anything else too. But cattle were the favorite topic because the cattle could move at a pretty good pace after being removed from a farm. The chiefs of the clans, each of the chiefs had a castle or tower along the borders called peel towers. And the lower levels of the tower, they could allow admit animals, cattle, and different things. And they would live in the upper reaches, storehouses, and could use this for fighting as well. Clans were heavily armed. They were mounted. They could travel fast in long periods in one evening. Here's a depiction of the border reivers protecting Langholm Castle on the border. Langholm was on the Scottish side. It was the home of the Maxwells. The Maxwells were one of the reiving clans, the big, strongest of the reiving clans. There were really about only two golden rules for the clans. One is you had to honor your clan and you had to steal. They looked at stealing as if the earth had been provided with all these goods to support mankind, go get it, steal it. The reivers did not really support any of the British or Scottish crown. Their allegiance was to themselves and their friends. Not every farm, every family was part of a clan. The clans were like big mafia gangs, basically. They were big into burning houses, burning entire villages. Kidnapping was a favorite sport. They would kidnap people, enemies from another clan, hold them ransom, and use them as bargaining items for further cattle or whatever. Blackmail originated in the borders. The reivers would offer a home insurance policy. So to not be burned and robbed, you had to pay the reivers who were powerful in that area, the clan that was powerful. So it's blackmail. And the origin of blackmail really was right on the Scottish-English borders. Some of the battles, particularly in the 1500s, the battles were big, several thousand people. They functioned as a cavalry, and these were between the English and the Scots, although sometimes one clan against another, but there were big pitched battles of the Scots versus the English. For example, the Armstrong clan, they could mount 3,000 fighters. They could put 3,000 fighters on horses, well armed, steel helmets, and that was a major fighting force. Other clans were nearly as large. The borders were ravaged. As English armies would go north to fight Scotland, they would tear the borders up. They'd raid the borders, do major destruction. Later, here come the Scottish army back down and do the same thing. These people lived in turmoil, fear of home, fear of property, fear of life for 300 years. And even within the same clan, the Armstrongs in Scotland may decide they didn't like some of the Armstrongs in England. So it was an open warfare. Allegiance was hard to determine sometimes. And compare that this is a painting noticed on the Calvary on the former slide. This is a depiction of the Battle of Culloden 200 years later from these border wars. They were not mounted. The British troops on the right, Scottish Highlanders on the left, not mounted, not nearly as well armed, although the English had muskets, not nearly as well armed and prepared for fighting as those border Scots earlier. Who are some of the common Reiver clans and their major feuds? Maxwell's for 100 years fought the Johnsons. I mean, frequently raiding, stealing, and not so much killing in the early years of the border wars, but in 1500s, it got bloody. A lot of people killed, as well as burning and property stolen. The Grahams were a big clan, and they were fighting the Irvines for 100 years or more. Kerrs versus the Scots, Scots versus the Elliots, Selbys versus the Greys. Armstrong was really the biggest clan. Armstrong, Bell, Burns, Crozer, Fenwick, Hall, Hume, Nixon, Robson, Musgrave, Story. These were some of the major Reiver clans. There were others, and not every family was in a clan, but these were the big clans. There was a picture some years ago with Lyndon Baines Johnson, Billy Graham, and Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, walked on the moon. That was an ironic photograph because each of those families are represented by fierce border Scot families. Graham, Johnson, and Armstrong. Well, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England, so he was king of both countries and Ireland, he decided to do something about these border wars. Basically, he took the clan leaders, a couple of dozen of the big clans, and hung them. He sent armies, military people into both sides of the border to suppress things. Nonsense was not put up with, and he basically suppressed things on the border. And simultaneously, things were going on in Ireland, and Northern Ireland particularly. There was a situation called the Flight of the Earls. Two big clans in Ireland, Catholic Irish clans, were the O'Neills and O'Donnells. They had been imprisoned, and through various manipulations, they gave up their large properties, large lands in Northern Ireland. There were two Scotsmen, Hugh Hamilton and Hugh Montgomery, came up with a scheme to help free some of the O'Neills and O'Donnells, free them, let them go to the continent in exchange for getting their lands. And two of these major properties were in the provinces of Antrim and Down, which you'll see on the next slide. In 1640, in Northern Ireland, there were about 100,000 Scottish, border Scots, and about 20,000 English, border English. Carrickfergus Castle here was a main prison and holding point in Belfast for the forces there in Northern Ireland. Here you see a map of Ireland, and the part in the top is so-called Northern Ireland. or Ulster. The Ulster was divided into different territories, different areas. The red areas were Scottish, predominantly Scottish. There was a blue area that was predominantly English. The purple area was English and Scottish. The tan, light brown areas were primarily Scottish. And there was a small area that was predominantly Irish. So Northern Ireland was divided up into these areas. The light brown area is Antrim and County Down. They were really privately owned by the Montgomery and Hamilton fellows, and they enticed settlers to come, primarily Scottish settlers, to come onto their private lands. So they would charge them rent, may give them a 20-year lease, for example, which they would have to pay an annual rent. The other areas were settled by the crown, by James I. Again, people who settled would have to pay rent. Usually they start off with a 20-year lease and rented the lands. They call this the plantation schemes. People were really renting farms, a few hundred acres maybe. Part of the scheme was to use the Protestants. The Scots were primarily Presbyterian. The English who came in were primarily Anglican, to use them to suppress the Irish Catholics. And it became, for long, it was also Presbyterians versus Anglicans. 1741, there was open warfare between the Irish and the Protestants. 4,000 or 5,000 people killed. And it was a time when many people decided to emigrate. Several other factors were important. The British Crown, James I had passed by the scene now, and you were dealing with Charles I and later James II, but they put huge tariffs on Ulster trade to England. Wool, cattle, beef, flax, the commodities from Ulster were high tariff put on them to trade into England. So this suppressed trade, suppressed the commerce there in Northern Ireland. Trade was forbidden to Europe or to the colonies, so this decreased their ability to sell things. The rents, these 20-year rents, rent leases that had been settled were running out. Rents were doubled, tripled. People could not pay. So the times were really tough economically. In the church, the Presbyterian situation got bad. A lot of the churches were closed. The churches were sanctioned, thanks to the extent that a Presbyterian minister married a couple. The couple had children. The children were deemed bastards, could not hold public office, and were severely discriminated against. And this did not sit well with these former border Scots. Migration was the solution. This is a Scottish immigrant memorial in Philadelphia. The main destiny for the Scots-Irish was the Delaware River, the ports on the Delaware River, particularly Philadelphia. By the American Revolution, by 1775, 76, there were at least 250,000 Scots-Irish in America. They had large families. Population of the colonies at that time was about 3 million. 1/6 of the American population were Scot-Irish or Ulster Scots. There were about 50 to 60,000 by the Revolution in North Carolina. In North Carolina, for example, there were also about 25,000 Highlanders. So half the population, the white population in North Carolina, were Scottish descended. about 1/3 of the population was slave or free black. So the immigration, the Ulster immigration was having major impact in this state, for example, but in many states. Well, what happened to these Scots-Irish when they got to Philadelphia? Well, Philadelphia had been settled by the Penn family. They really had no immigration things to prevent immigration. They encouraged it. Whereas the Highland Scots going into North Carolina had to swear an oath to the King of England. People were freely admitted into the Penn colony, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania politically at the time was controlled by the Quakers and somewhat by the German settlers. So the Scots-Irish quickly were pushed to the western part of the state, and part of the plan there was let the Scots-Irish fight the Indians. Land was expensive in Pennsylvania, and very quickly the Scots-Irish decided to keep moving, move into Maryland, Delaware, into the Shenandoah Valley. They went all the way to the Appalachians and headed south. Before long, they were in the Carolinas, Georgia, in what is now Tennessee, which was North Carolina at the time. Before too long, they were in Kentucky, West Virginia, and a lot of places. So the economics forces further migration out of Pennsylvania southward. How did they get to the south? It was a great wagon road from Philadelphia, 700 miles from Philadelphia to Augusta, Georgia. In a wagon, you could make about 5 miles a day, 3 to 4 months to Augusta. Along the way, you had to obtain food, forage for the animals. Accidents occurred, people got sick, people died. So it was a tortuous journey. Here's a great Conestoga wagon. Not everyone traveled in the great Conestoga wagons made in Pennsylvania, but some did. These were robust. You could get entire family, household belongings in a Conestoga, pulled by 4 to 6 horses. Can you imagine going 5 miles a day, having to feed those horses, find forage for the horses, food for the people, and hopefully not having an Indian attack or some major accident. A lot of the settlers set out in convoys. Entire neighborhoods would pack up and leave together, headed down the Great Wagon Road. Hundreds of wagons a day would pass a particular point. These people were former neighbors. They were traveling together for mutual protection, aid in breakdowns. There was a socialization factor, and they were sharing dreams, wondering what was ahead, what would happen, and looking for prosperity. Well, what did the Ulster Scots do when they settled out of Pennsylvania? Typically, they build log cabins, simple log cabins, one room, dirt floor, water they'd get out of a spring. They would throw this cabin up in a couple of days, really. They would do some farming. The land would become poor, and they would move. So every 3 to 4 years, they'd pack up and move south, move further west. A lot of the Ulster Scots simply squatted on the land, did not, a lot of the lands they were moving into, there was really no legal system, no courts, judges, and they just squat on the land and dare a tax collector to come. Then they'd move in 3 or 4 years. And basically they intermarried. Ulster Scots intermarried within themselves, so it kept a tight-knit culture. What about their entertainment? Well, they brought some of this straight from the borders and from Ulster. Fiddles, clogging, country ballads. Ballads were a big deal on the Scottish border, romanticizing raids and different aspects of life. Guitar, banjos got added. And what happened, really, this is the roots of much of what is now called country music and bluegrass. So this was a distinct cultural contribution of the Ulster Scots and the other Scots as well to the American scene. What about money? Corn was easy to grow. It was hard. It was not that easy to sell. It was much easier to sell whiskey made from corn. So whiskey stills, whiskey became a major industry as the Ulster Scots created farms and communities. A lot of people were afraid to even drink water. Whiskey was the main drink of many of the men. Well, what were these people like? Well, they were on the frontier. The Cavaliers in Virginia, the Quakers in Pennsylvania had encouraged the Ulster Scots to move to the border, move to the mountains, and provide the buffer against hostile Indians. Here are some of the typical Ulster Scot frontier fighters: Davy Crockett, Sam Houston, Jim Bowie, Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, Andrew Jackson. They dressed rough, animal skins, and that they were tough, self-reliant people who did not fear moving into new country and protecting themselves. So this is sort of the archetypical Ulster Scot frontiersman. Where did the Ulster Scots go? Well, eventually, this was a scatter map done 20 years ago, maybe. But you can see that the Scots-Irish, the Ulster Scots really went over much of the country. There were very few in the upper Midwest, not too many down in southern part of California. But if you look down the Appalachians, Virginia into North Carolina was heavily populated by the Ulster Scots. And basically they are all over the country though, very wide distribution. But they're particularly concentrated in the Appalachians and the southern states. What are some of the things that were positive? Princeton University. Princeton started as a college in New Jersey. It was a Scots-Irish institution. There was a split in the Presbyterian between the new side and the old side. The old side were more Calvinistic. The new side had different ideas, were more liberal, more open to Reformation, to progressive principles. The new side founded Princeton. It was Presbyterian, but admitted any denomination. A lot of Southern students went to Princeton. By the time of the American Revolution, in North Carolina, there were 23 Princeton graduates. If you look at graduates of other universities in North Carolina, there were 3 or 4 Yale, Harvard, William and Mary graduates, and a couple from British universities. But there were far more Princeton graduates in North Carolina than all the other graduates combined. Princeton was a major force, major factor in the southern states as far as producing university educated leaders, preachers, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. Just looking at North Carolina, for example, these were Princeton graduates at the time of the Revolution. Many of these were ministers, Some were ministers as well as military people like James Hall, for example. Some of these were lawyers, military people, doctors. So about 25 Princeton graduates in one state. This was a major influence intellectually on the state. UNC Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, first state university. Large support was from the Scots-Irish community. The father of the university, William Davey, Samuel McCorkle, were Scot-Irish. Joseph Caldwell, the first president, all the early faculty were Princeton graduates and Ulster Scots. And this was true really up until the Civil War. So it's largely a Scot-Irish Presbyterian institution. Davidson College, another very good college within the state, totally Scots-Irish, Ulster Scot founded. And it's interesting, in the Charlotte era during the Revolution was referred to as a hornet's nest. And some of the British officers recognized, admitted that the most hostile area of the entire United States was from Charlotte to Salisbury, Mecklenburg County up to Rowan County. That this is the most hostile area in the colonies. Here's an example of Ulster Scot success, really. The Battle of Kings Mountain was an interesting battle. It was really a battle of patriot militia versus loyalist militia. There was only one British general involved in the fight, and that was Patrick Ferguson. He had gone through the North Carolina mountains posting notices that he was going to burn any patriot. He's going to burn them and kill them. Well, this kind of made people mad. So Kings Mountain, which is right below Charlotte, across the North Carolina border into South Carolina, these two groups clashed. The Over Mountain men, the Patriots, were almost entirely Scot-Irish, Presbyterian. And they encountered the Loyalists, who were largely from South Carolina, and about 1,000 on each side. The Scots-Irish came from Western North Carolina, Western Southwest Virginia, Northwest South Carolina, and a lot of them came from Western North Carolina, which is now Tennessee. They were called the Over Mountain Men. This was a turning point in the Revolution. And this is really a Reaver heritage. This Reaver heritage just was on full display at Kings Mountain. George Washington admitted that half of the American army, of the entire American army in the Revolution, was Ulster Scot. The Pennsylvania line was 100% Ulster Scot. So the Ulster Scots, Scot-Irish, played a major role in the success of the American Revolution, as did the French, by the way. One Hessian captain stated, this is not an American war, it's a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian war. I think that's a significant statement. Oh, what are some of the other effects? Look at the US presidents. There were 17, not counting John F. Kennedy was Catholic, but there were 17 presidents with significant Scot-Irish ancestry. Ulysses S. Grant, Woodrow Wilson, even Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, for example. But the presidents of North Carolina, Andrew Jackson, born right on the South Carolina border, James K. Polk, Andrew Johnson, were Scot-Irish. There were 17 of them. And so this was a significant thing. How many Germans How many presidents are of German origin? Trump. Uh, uh, Teddy Roosevelt is interesting. He was Dutch origin, of course, but his mother was Scot-Irish. So when you start looking at where these people came from and their ancestors, the Ulster Scots had a major impact on the presidents in the United States. Well, that's the end of the presentation. I tried to show you some of the rough edges of the Ulster Scots, some of the polished edges as well. It's an interesting story, and it's a story not understood by most Americans. Thank you.
Well, very, very well done, Donald. That was just terribly interesting and jam-packed with information for everyone. I'd like to encourage everyone to unmute your microphones and reinitiate your cameras so that we can have some informal question-answer discussion with Donald, and I will attempt to try to do some of that myself. But please don't be shy.
Sorry I was late, but I want to lean in and lift up Don's comment about the uh, between the Grahams and other rivers. I'm still talking to John Threepwood with a glanced eye. I've got to keep an eye on that boy.
Jim
Armstrong.
Graham.
Yeah.
Jim Graham, I could have had a few more comments about what
what
James I did.
Yeah.
He exiled a couple of hundred Grahams, forced them to go to the Low Countries and join the British Army just to get rid of them.
Well, that was an optional mandatory invitation, wasn't it?
Yeah, a lot of them snuck back in, but they were forced into exile. That's a rough bunch, your ancestors.
Still making Scots whiskey, but they call it moonshine up here in North Carolina.
How much intermarriage was there between the French Huguenots and the Scots-Irish?
Well, there were quite a few Huguenots. In addition to the border Scots, there were quite a few Huguenots who left France and went to Northern Ireland. And like if you look at the Presbyterian churches here in North Carolina, who the early members were, you see Huguenot names. So they were Presbyterian-like and wound up as Presbyterians, and once they went to Ulster. And they show up in the church rolls right here in North Carolina.
Do you have any Scottish history books you would recommend? Ulster Scott history books?
Well, I'm having a little speak up, please.
Do you have any Ulster Scott history books that you would recommend?
Yes. Can you see this? It's called The Steel Bonnets. George MacDonald Fraser. It's an excellent book. Goes into a lot of detail, a lot of the personalities, and it's a very good read. He's a good historian.
Who is the author?
George MacDonald Fraser.
Where would the North Carolinian Quakers have come from?
For some reason, my volume is not coming through good here. Repeat that, please.
All of my North Carolinian ancestors were Quakers. Where would they have come from?
Well, North Carolina is an interesting history. Like when you look at the people, eastern part of the state were largely English people who came down from Virginia. The rest of the state, not, except for the African population, but the rest of the state was a Pennsylvania state. The Quakers came down in the High Point, Greensboro area. They were from Pennsylvania. The Moravians came down from Pennsylvania in the Winston-Salem area. And then the Scots-Irish. So they were all Pennsylvania exiles into North Carolina. So we were almost a Pennsylvania state.
Interesting. My Quakers came through the very northern tip of North Carolina, and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought on their ancestral land
Okay,
during the Revolutionary War.
that's in Greensboro, and that's right in the heart of Quaker country.
Where did the James Hall come from that you mentioned that had gone to Princeton University? Because I have a lot of connections. That's a family name in mine, family from the Wilmington area. Was that where he went to, or was it a different
What
James
is the
Hall?
name? What is
James
the name?
Hall? You mentioned earlier in one of your slides.
Hall is over in the Salisbury, Statesville area in the Piedmont, middle part of the state. There are a lot of halls in that area, but there are halls otherwise in the state. But Hall was an interesting Princeton grad. He was a minister. He was a cavalry officer in the Revolution. He took 2 huge missionary trips to the Natchez Territory, Mississippi, 1,200 miles each way twice. He was an interesting, he was pastor for 3 churches in the Statesville area, Bethany, Concord, and they're called Fourth Creek Presbyterian, which is now First Presbyterian in Statesville. Interesting, but there are a lot of halls. He had a lot of relatives in the area.
Yeah, Don, there's quite a few halls here in the Wilmington area. Actually, one of the more famous ones, I guess, at least locally famous, was Dr. Frank B. Frank Hall. He was a Presbyterian minister and a professor of philosophy at UNC Wilmington. Also, there was a Dr. Hall, was quite well known in Wilmington.
Hello, Bob.
Hello.
My question is, the session's being recorded. When will the recording be available, Connie?
Mary, I believe the couple of weeks would probably be about right. We're very involved in festival planning at the moment, and the gentleman who does that is managing the festival from a logistics perspective. Mary Irwin is the president of Clan Irwin Society, and Don mentioned the Irwins earlier too in the discussion.
Yes, he did. So, well, my husband came in after Don's remarks began, and when they ended, he said, "That was fascinating."
It really was.
Yeah.
And Mary, I'm looking forward to seeing you. So that's all I'll say about that.
You too. Yep.
Where did many of the Ulster Scots who came from different cities in Northern Ireland, where did they typically come into the United States?
Early in the immigration, there were 5 ships that came into Boston. And many of those Ulster Scots wound up in Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, as well as in the Boston area. But the great majority of that 250,000 Ulster Scots came in the Delaware River, largely into the port of Philadelphia.
What about Canada? What about migration into Canada from the Ulster Scots?
Well, some of those Boston Scots, and then probably some of the Philadelphia Ulster Scots as well, wound up in Canada. I'm not familiar with if there were direct ships going into Canada, but there are a lot of Scots-Irish in Canada as well. So they're all over.
Well, and Don, would you care to comment on the Bible Belt?
And people don't know much about them, and they don't know much about themselves, I find out.
Donald, would you care to comment on the Scots' leadership in the Bible Belt?
Well, I didn't want to get into that.
Well, then don't.
Uh, there's a book, Jim Webb, who's a big telescope that's named after, was a congressman. Jim Webb, he's Ulster Scot, and he wrote a book called The Fighting Ulster Scots or something like that. But he went into all this how tough and rough and whatever they were. But there's another thing is that the Scots-Irish are responsible for the Bible Belt.
Yes, whoever's typing, if you would just mute your microphone, please. It's making background
But
noise.
what happened, the early Ulster Scots were Presbyterian. The Presbyterian Church has a very tough, you got it to be a Presbyterian minister, you've got to be university trained, be approved by seminary, do practice work and so forth. And there weren't enough educated people to supply all these Scots-Irish moving west and south with ministers. So many of them wound up Baptists and Methodists, Free Will Baptists, and all kind of other sects. So the Presbyterian lost hold of them, and that's pretty much what is called the Bible Belt, particularly in the South and Oklahoma, places like that.
Billy Graham, Pat Robertson, and so forth, they all have Scottish names.
Yeah.
And we have several people adding comments into the chat. For those of you who are following.
Don, this is Dennis. Would you expand on your comments on President Kennedy's heritage?
Is that Dennis?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, President Kennedy was definitely Irish, but he was Catholic Irish. He was definitely Catholic Irish, as is Joe Biden, by the way. So they didn't quite make the chart there as being Ulster Scot descended.
Right.
But
Yes, actually, I did my best to trace him back to Scottish ancestry, but the Kennedy family was originated down in southwestern Ireland. And so even though Kennedy is one of the prominent clans in Scotland, it seems that John F's family appears to be from Southern Ireland.
Yeah, there are Scottish Kennedys as well as Irish Kennedys. Yes,
that's right. And of course, you know, during the prehistoric times, we have no literature to refer to, so you never know. Peter Wilson added into the chat that everyone may be interested in a book called A Dance Called America as well. I have a copy of that. It's really excellent. Other discussion with Dawn. You don't have to ask questions if you have comments. We'd love to hear them.
There's someone with their hand up.
Oh, Karen, do you have your hand up?
I do.
Oh, forgive me.
And that's okay. I was just actually typing my question in, and I was going to ask him if I'm doing, and I do a lot of genealogy research. If I'm looking in Northern Ireland, would I need to look just in Ireland in the 1700s to the 1800s? My maiden name is Rutherford, and I am still trying to get back to Scotland through my great-grandfather.
the Weatherfords were one of those border clans I didn't list. So you may very well be Ulster Scot descended. Weatherford was one of the clans. I didn't list nearly all the clans.
Well, a few years ago, we weren't even considered a clan, I don't think, but I did notice when I Googled my name, I found that a tartan has been created for for Rutherfords, which I got a big kick out of. Some man in Michigan commissioned it, and so I took a screenshot of that particular item. But yeah, I'm still trying to get back now. I am working on joining the DAR and Daughters of American Revolution. And so far, I have one patriot that's going back to Scotland. And I've got to look more into that. So, but my big problem is how to find out how and when the Rutherford that I descend from got here, and from whether it was Scotland or Northern Ireland. And my second great grandfather supposedly was born in Ohio in 1804. So I'm stuck there.
It's interesting though about the tartan business. The border Scots in 1700s, for example, they would have never worn any tartan or a kilt or a bagpipe. That was a Gallic thing, a Highland Scot thing.
Yes.
But now you see people of Ulster Scot descent showing up at special occasions in kilts and all, but that was not a border Scot thing.
Right. And I really have been aware of that. I live in the Villages, Florida, and we have like over 3,000 clubs. And I belong to the Brits and Us Club. The British and the Scottish club merged. And I have a particular shoulder, I'm not sure what you call it, but a woman wears it on her shoulder. It's like a scarf, but you wear it on your shoulder. And so it tends to be in the colors of this tartan that I know that my family didn't have.
Excuse me,
praise-
Karen. Oh, I'm sorry, Dawn. Karen, I
praise
put
tartan.
oh, go ahead, Dawn, sorry.
Praise tartan. Everybody needs some.
Karen, I put my email address in the chat, and if you'll send me an email, I will hook you up with a good genealogist who can give you some free advice.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Great. And in fact, I actually coordinate a class here in the Villages for Midwest states. And we have everybody searching for their way over from Scotland or Ireland or wherever. And, the British Isles, once you do your DNA, then you're kind of like crazy looking for the way over, because somehow your family got here. But thank you for I will copy that.
Karen,
Okay.
the garment that you talk about was we generally refer to as a sash.
Yes.
And I wear one that represents all of the clans that I belong to.
Oh. Wow.
Hey,
Okay.
thank you, Catherine. That's great.
Well, that's really cool. Mine just has the one bow type thing. And when I lived in Chicago, I was a member of the St. Andrew's Society and attended various events, and also the Robbie Burns supper. Now we have that down here in the Villages every year. You'd be surprised how many people get all excited about that.
Karen, do send me the email, and maybe we can collaborate somehow.
Okay.
Connie, we're not seeing,
Other questions or comments? Yes.
Connie, we're not seeing your post in the chat. I don't know if you're
Really?
I'm
privately.
not seeing it either.
Okay. I'll try it again. I'll work on that right now.
Maybe it has I can put it in there if you want, but
It's just, I'll do it. I'll do it real fast.
the true drop down might be private or something. So in your chat.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. Do you want to do it? It's Constance Nestor, N as in Nancy, E Edward, S Sam, T Tom, OR, at Scottish, AHF for American History Forum.com. Constance Nestor at Scottish, AHF.com. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have a quick comment about the Rutherfords. I'm actually from the Scottish borders, and Rutherford's a very common name, especially in my hometown, which is Selkirk. A lot of actually some famous, or at least Scottish famous people are called Rutherford out of Selkirk, and it's very common for us for the sash. It's very common for us in Scotland to call that a plaid, even though plaid is the tartan. Many times we'll actually call the sash a plaid.
A plaid. Okay. Thank you.
And
Well,
and also just to bring it back to there was a question at the start about the marches, and Connie, you mentioned the festival that's coming up. The festivals in the borders towns every year typically have a riding of the marches, which is each town there's the townsfolk on horses ride around the marches or the boundaries of the town to protect them from the reavers, and that happens typically every year in June and July. So marches is very much common phrase used in the borders.
Thank you, Stephen.
Hey, Stephen, I just want to let you know Clan Hay was our honor clan a few years ago here at the Chicago Festival. Merlin of Errol was here. But if you could shoot me an email, I'd like to collaborate with you on those border festivals, Stephen,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Yep.
So
I'll actually come see you, Connie, at the Highland Games. I'm volunteering, so I'll see you there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Marty?
yeah, I had a question. So I actually yesterday I signed up to volunteer. So I'll be at the admission gate or whatever it is from Friday afternoon. But I got to admit, Scary Ver was really the big draw for me. So my Scottish roots are that I'm most interested in is Porterfields that are from just outside Paisley near a town called Kilmacombe. Um, they had um, they had a coat of arms. It was granted. If you look in the book, it's one of those with the slashes through it. That happened a few years after. It's a long legal story that seems to be well documented. So I really never felt, beyond all the people trying to sell you clanny stuff. My general assumption is that the Porterfields really aren't a clan per se, although I have a strong affinity to that part of my um, um, genealogy, if you will. So. And they went to Donegal. So I was curious. So there's a question here somewhere. So Donegal, you mentioned the speaker was talking mainly about Antrim and over on the east side. Donegal is my understanding um, had more official, and they had like my folks seemed to be in an area called the Abercorn estates that by another, I think a different Hamilton. Anybody have any knowledge of that Donegal in general and the Hamilton the Abercorn estates?
Donegal is in the western part of the Ulster area.
Yeah.
Anybody know? I should know, but I can't speak to it at the moment.
Have a hand raised.
Yes, that's probably for another question, Rowan. I was about to call on him. Marty, if you'll send me an email, I'll try to help you out with that. We'll bird dog it, okay?
You're going to be at you said you're going to be at the cottage.
I'll be at the
games.
Chicago Festival at the History Tent. And I go back and forth to Scotland quite a bit too. So
Okay.
would love to look into that with you. Rowan, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you. I have recently developed an interest in genealogy, I guess. I was born and raised in like North Carolina, and I've always known I had like a Appalachian like folk legend as like a great 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 uncle or whatever. Even got like a folk song about him. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Tom Dooley.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm related to him. So, but like I'd never really looked like further back than that. And so I just recently started looking further back, and I found like there's a lot of like Scottish like names in my family history. So I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering about like, yeah, that's it. That's the lyrics. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Um, and I was just wondering, like, are there any like recommendations for like getting started with that? Because I have found like so many like names that are like, I'm pretty sure like Scottish, like Greer and Chalmers and Douglas, and there's been a lot.
Rowan, can you shoot me an email and I will
Sure.
hook you up with Beth Schulman. She's pure Scot, but she married a German, I believe. But she's our genealogy expert up here in Chicago, and we'll be happy to help anybody who needs a reference, who needs Bess's email. Just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to help.
Cool. Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you.
And you know, there used to be a comedy show on years ago, maybe before your time, called Rowan and Martin, and they were both Scots.
Yeah, that would be before my time. I haven't heard of it. I'm sorry.
Other comments or questions? Just speak up. You don't have to hold up your hand because I can't see everybody all at the same time. There are so many on. Although Mary's helping me quite a bit. Thank you, Mary. Okay, any other questions or comments today?
Well, you've inspired me. I'm thinking about driving or flying up to go because I used to go every year to the festival, and I've gotten very lazy about that since I live in Florida now.
Well, get on that plane and come on up.
Okay.
We'll be looking for you, Karen.
Okay.
All right. Well, Dawn, any closing comments or anything before we thank everyone? Dawn, we can't thank you enough. Dawn is just so thorough and so well versed in history in America, especially. And Dawn, it's always just a pleasure and enlightening whenever you address our group. So thank you so much for preparing and presenting this today.
I enjoyed it. Is Beth Resman on? Beth, are you there?
I know she was muted a while ago.
She was a PharmD student of mine years ago.
Wow.
And
I'm still
there
on.
She is. There she is. Okay.
Beth, how are you? Beth, how are you? I'll give you a call
Good.
one day. I will give you a call.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we'll go ahead and close for the day. I just can't thank all of you enough for participating and helping to keep our Scottish culture and our Scots-Irish culture and really all of our genealogies going by participating in this forum every month. I'd like to thank Gus for being here. And really, this is a tremendously illustrious group. We've got presidents of societies and founders of societies, and Peter's here from Scottish Heritage, and on and on and on. So it's and historians on today. We thank you. We hope you'll join every month. We won't be holding one in June, but that's totally, I think that's the first time that's ever happened. But please join us in July and then on from there. And until we see you next time, be safe, everyone. I'll leave the Zoom going if anybody wants to just chat for a while. But thank you
so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you.